There it goes. Excellent. Recording in progress. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Annette Bourne, our co-chair for our EDI committee. Take it away, Annette.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Patrick McKenna and I would like to really welcome all of you to the first event for the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of the Rhode Island chapter of the APA. Obviously, February was Black History Month, but you know, it really isn't just allotted to a month anyway. It is part of American history. So we are very grateful for Tracy Picard and to Bob Azar for making time here today. For those of you who are AICP, this is worth one equity credit. So file for your CMs there. And I'm just going to give a brief bio of each of our Tracy will be a presenter, and Bob will give us some context as it relates to current planning and zoning in the city. So Tracy Picard is a public historian. She has a wide variety of interests, but serves as the co-chair of the Snowtown research team and the lead researcher and editor of the Doors Open RI Providence Waterways Project. Her research centers around the history of healthcare, especially in the 18th and 19th century Atlantic world, and the convergence of African, European, and indigenous ideas. I'll ask whoever needs to mute. There it goes. Bob, as probably most all of you know, is the deputy director of the city's of Providence's Department of Planning and Development. He serves on the State Planning Council and is associate professor of the practice of urban studies at Brown University. I've had the pleasure of having a number of your students, Bob, as interns, and they all speak highly of your classes. He has been with the city 21 years, and just, you know, he is what we all know about Providence. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Tracy. For those of you, we are thinking about doing this as a possible mobile tour for SNEPA. So if you like the way this works, please let us know. Jeff and I are both on the SNEPA committee. If you think this is worthwhile, it would be great to be able to invite Tracy back to actually have us walk the tour. So thank you very much. Tracy, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I really specifically like what Annette just said, which is that Black history is not confined to a particular month because, as you say, it's part of American history and it's also part of Providence history. So while this is, we had to call it something, it is called the Black History Tour. It is the Providence History Tour, more accurately. I wrote this tour specifically about early Black history, partly because you have to end it at some point, otherwise it would go on and on and on. But specifically, we're going to be talking about the time period of about 1700 to the mid 1800s. I'm sorry if I leave out your favorite historic character, but we had to set the scope somehow. And as Annette also mentioned, this was originally planned to be a walking tour, and we had, we very much recommend people take the map itself and go out and walk the sites. But this tour came out about 1 month before the beginning of COVID. So we had, this is really one of my first few engagements because of the COVID problems. So I'm very excited to actually do some in-person walks. So this is not, this tour was not intended to be specifically about slavery, right? Black history is not just slavery, but we can't really talk about Black history in Providence or any history in Providence without discussing the issue of slavery. Slavery was a system that was actually very important in Providence, something that I didn't learn in school, but I was very surprised to understand that not only, oh, we have the, there we go. not only do we have the direct role of enslavers, but we also have something called the business of slavery. So the transatlantic slave trade was intentionally created for the primary reason of making money. And often we learn about slavery from school or the media, and the picture that we get is a Southern picture of slavery, right? Often our images are of the mid 1800s. We think about a large plantation. We often think about, movies such as Gone with the Wind, and that is not what we would see when we think about slavery in Providence. Slavery lasted for several hundred years, and it existed in diverse places. Sorry. Okay. And it was not a uniform experience. Sorry about the dog. It's the days of Zoom. This is important to know because the colony, then state of Rhode Island, was actually a major player in the transatlantic slave trade, which is also called the triangle trade. Triangles being West Africa, the Caribbean, and what's now North America. So as far as we know, Providence merchants sent at least 55 ships to the coast of Africa. In the mid 1700s, enslaved Africans and people of African origin made up about 11% of the total Rhode Island population. It was concentrated in a few areas: Newport, Bristol, Providence. So we're talking about a urban slavery in the North. We just have to define really quickly that slavery is not the same as indenture. Often in an area like Rhode Island, we hear about other types of unfreedom that was occurring at the same time. So indenture is a system that may act similar to slavery, and we do have multiple people facing that. But slavery it comes specifically with ownership, the ownership of one person over another, race-based and for life. Indenture is a temporary state, which almost always is set to a specific end time. Okay, so that's basically just starting with the definition of slavery so that we're all on the same page and we know what we're talking about here. There's a little bit of a myth of the good enslaver in Rhode Island, in Providence, and it's not so much the behavior of the enslaver, but the system itself. There's an important piece here that we have to understand, that this is kind of the root of white supremacy itself. It's not about good or bad behavior. It's about a system of ownership. Okay, so now we've got that out of the way. We're going to start our tour at North Burial Ground. So if we're going to zoom in on the map, do we want to actually look at the map itself?
Yes, I would encourage us to look at the map. Yeah.
Right here. So North Burial Ground, and that is the city's Providence was first a town and became a city in 1831. So let's just say the town of Providence made this burial ground in 1700. The first burial was 1711. And something very interesting about North Burial Ground is that although there seems to be a large amount of headstones there, about 40,000, that only represents about 25 to 30% of the total burials. So as you're walking through North Burial Ground, and we'll see a large amount of headstones, there's so many people that don't have one. And as I mentioned earlier, about 11% of the Rhode Island population was enslaved people in the mid 1700s. We know there are many, many, many people buried there that we don't know about. Record keeping didn't start until the mid 1800s.
Tracy,
So-
I don't mean to interrupt, but Johanna asked in the chat, could you point your cursor to where we are on the map? I think it's at number 1, right? We're looking at.
It is slightly off the map, and there's an A. If you go, ooh, yep, A right there. A is pointing to it, so it's just off the map right there. So North Main Street, will take you right to it. And it's a gigantic piece of land. Oh yeah, thank you. There you go. Got the map there. Okay. So it's a gigantic piece of land. And yeah, like I said, there's many, many, many people who are not marked there. But there's a few in particular that we're going to hear about possibly later. Let's talk quickly about Pero-Paget and Yarrow and African. That's what he's called there. Pero-Paget will come up for us several times because he is one of the people that helped build Market House and University Hall. He's buried in North Burial Ground along with his wife and one of their children. And one of the reasons why it's important to note some of these headstones is that often enslaved people did not write the headstone itself. So we will often see some pretty interesting, maybe not so good epitaphs being written on these headstones. For example, they would say, let's take Anna Bowen, for example. Her epitaph lists her as a slave of Jabez Bowen, Dr. Jabez Bowen. The reason that this is important is that people take it for granted that we will be able to choose what we want to put on our own headstone. It's something about freedom. It's something about self-determination that we, often write in our will or discuss with our family. This is how I'd like to be remembered. And if we could just imagine for a second what it might be like that your headstone is written by someone who has enslaved you for life. And that is one of the main concerns about the enslaved people buried in North Burial Ground. The other situation in North Burial Ground is that many of the people who did not receive burial by the enslaver, many of the enslaved people, are buried in what's called the free grounds. So this is an area way, way, way in the back. There's been about 8 free grounds over time, and they've all been consolidated into one. And people who weren't able to afford a burial were put into a free ground. They were segregated originally, although they're now all together. And most of the people there didn't have a headstone, possibly had a number, but often had nothing. So there's a lot of inequity in the way that people are remembered in the North Burial Ground, both due to enslavement, due to poverty, and also due to the free grounds. And go ahead and if you have questions, put it in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that, but we'll also do Q&A at the end in case people have some questions coming up. Quickly, Yarrow is marked there as Yarrow and African. That's the way that he's remembered. And while we're not 100% sure, there was a man named Yarrow who was enslaved by the Browns. And I think there's a pretty good chance, it's an unusual name, that Yarrow was that person. So we're going to go a little bit over to what's on the map, the one, and that is St. John's Cathedral. And St. John's Cathedral was one of the earliest churches built in Providence. Originally, it was called King's Church, but that name was changed because after the Revolutionary War, because people kind of wanted the king to go on his merry way and not call things by that name anymore. This was an Episcopal church, and many of the people who joined this church and attended this church, the way it was funded and the way it was built, those people were enslavers and people who participated directly in the slave trade. Enslaved people labored in this church, free and enslaved Black people, and they're also buried here. In the baptismal records of St. John's, there's multiple examples of enslaved and free Black people being baptized. It may be easy to think about baptism as an unmitigated good, but often baptism was a way that upheld the practice of slavery. There was this idea amongst a huge amount of white colonists that slavery was excusable because through slavery, the white people were bringing people of color into the Christian religion. Baptism was one piece of that, and church attendance was another. Burial was also sometimes seen as a way to bring people into that system. So they were baptized, they were welcomed into the church, but they could never be an equal participant. Black people were not allowed to be leaders in the church. They didn't necessarily have a say in what happened. And they also often sat in segregated sections, whether enslaved or free. There was a system of pew owning, and Black people were placed separately. This situation must have been very frustrating, but it did eventually lead to the emergence of Black churches in Providence. For example, the African Union Meeting and Schoolhouse in the 1820s. We have the Congdon Street Baptist Church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Only Street Church. So it does appear from this that Black people over time, especially as they became free, were frustrated with the situation at churches like St. John's Cathedral, and that prompted them to make their own churches, some of which still exist today. So quickly, the enslavers in the church, could name a few: Samuel Chase, Thomas Lloyd Halsey, Cyprian Sterry, Gabriel Bernard. And because of this, enslaved people were also buried in the church's burial ground, which is visitable, and you can stop into that church and see the headstone of Phyllis, Rose, and Fanny Chase. Phyllis was Rose's mother. Rose was Fanny's mother. Phyllis was Rose's mother. Rose was Fanny's mother. So Phyllis was Fanny's grandmother. Okay. And all three were enslaved by the Samuel Chase and his family on South Main Street. We don't know very much about their lives, unfortunately. That's about all I've been able to uncover so far. And I was only able to find that information from the smallpox records. This is important because when we think about doing research on 1700s Black history, we can think about how the archive itself is inequitable. We have so many records from Samuel Chase, the enslaver, and so few records of these three women that he enslaved. And although we really, that's not a very satisfying answer to me to just say that's how it is and move on. But I like to think about that inequity in the archives as a way for us to try to do better in the future and think about ways we can try to heal that problem. Okay, St. John's Cathedral. So now very close to St. John's Cathedral is a neighborhood that used to exist within seeing distance from the front step where you'd be standing right there. The location of the round State House right now used to be a neighborhood called Snowtown. Snowtown is essentially the area of the round State House, the Amtrak station, and the surrounding area. Is actually a pretty small neighborhood. It's not large. And in about the 1820s, this area, which was at the head of the Providence Cove, now gone. That's an interesting story for planning. The cove itself has now been filled in. Oh yeah, we can see on the map right here. State House, Gaspee Street, the very beginning of Smith Street. And then across the street was a road called Martin Street and back. And that was Snowtown. Okay, so Snowtown was a small mixed race neighborhood that sprang up in about the 1820s. We kind of take a leap from Phyllis, Rose, and Fanny into Snowtown and what happened in between their story and this story. There's something called gradual emancipation, which in 1784 was passed in Rhode Island, which stated that people born after that time would not be enslaved. So it was a slow outlawing of slavery. Immediately during and immediately after the Revolutionary War, there was kind of a big wave of emancipation, which means the freeing of enslaved people. So the free population of Black people in Providence increased by leaps and bounds. And where would people go? During slavery, of course, most Black people would live with the enslaver. And then after a lot of this emancipation, people had to move somewhere else. So a small neighborhood formed called Snowtown. Okay, early 1820s. We have poor white people, Black people living together, kind of small houses, not in particularly great shape. It's generally considered a low-income neighborhood. And this place is best known for what happened in 1831, which is a riot. It was a racially motivated riot that began in Olney Street. Over the course of several days, moved over to Snowtown. This riot itself, racial incident itself, resulted in the damage to about a dozen houses, mainly those that were occupied by Black people in Snowtown, but they were actually owned by some of the elite Providence landlords like Nicholas Brown, for example. So it was a kind of a complicated story. We won't get too much into that. I could talk about that for days, actually. But let's actually highlight a story of someone who lived there. Part of my work at the Snowtown Project is to move the story away from the 4-day-long incident of a riot, it's called, or racial incident, to the stories of people who lived there, who worked there, and what their lives were like. Obviously, you know, this is another case where we have the archival silence, where there's no book about Snowtown. There's not a lot of records, and it's been difficult to piece together some of these stories. But one story that stands out to me is Abraham Gibbs. So Abraham Gibbs was a Black man. He says in several sources that he was born in Charleston, South Carolina, around 1756. He came to Rhode Island, we don't know exactly when, and he married a woman named Sarah from Smithfield. He worked as a sailor, a cooper, that means a barrel maker, a laborer, a shoemaker, a landlord. He really did a lot of different things. And one of the most interesting things about the early 1820s is that people really had to look for opportunities where they could find them, adapt to different things. It wasn't always easy. Oh, look at that. Thank you. It wasn't always easy to just do one thing, right? You kind of had to take on different jobs seasonally, according to what was in demand at the time. So he does all different kinds of jobs. He has a family. He has several children, including a son named Thomas and a daughter named Eunice. In 1803, Abraham Gibbs took a job aboard John Brown's ship, the General Washington. It was headed to Savannah, Georgia. It's unclear exactly what happened, but Abraham and the entire crew deserted the ship. John Brown was very mad, and he tries to go after Abraham and the rest of the crew, but then he died. John Brown died in 1803. So Abraham Gibbs, I guess, gets lucky there, and not much comes out of it. He goes on to make several other trips and do work. He lives until 1830. He owns at least 2 small homes in Snowtown. He lives in one and he rents the other one out. So Snowtown was a place where there was a high number of renters, but there are also quite a few people who own property and stayed there for a while. So he's one of the people who lived there for probably about 15 to 20 years. So he died in 1830 at the age of 74. And in his will, his inventory and will, we know that he was literate because he had several books, which was somewhat unusual at that time. People of low income, if they had a will at all, rarely would include books in the will. So will is, where you write what you're giving to people, and the inventory is just a list of all the things in your house at the time of death. So those two go together, a will and an inventory. Okay, Snowtown itself, even after experiencing the riot, went on to thrive for about 40 to 50 more years, it was a site of a lot of struggle. There was quite a bit of cholera there in the 1840s and 1850s, possibly because there was so much pollution coming in from the river. The Blackstone Canal went right by, the Meshasik and Woonasquatucket were nearby, and then the Cove. From a planning perspective, that's particularly interesting because the low-income neighborhood received the brunt of the pollution and experienced multiple outbreaks, and it was eventually eliminated due to redevelopment. So you can see in this map here that the railroad ends up buying a lot of the property that was Snowtown and then runs their rails right through it, some of which have been scaled back, and then it becomes the State House that we know now. Okay, so going back to the map, we're going to skip a few locations because we can't possibly talk about every single one. But we're going to just touch really quickly on Bowen Street, and that should be number 4 on the map. It's a quick 2 blocks away. Okay, number 4, and that was the home of Dr. Jabez Bowen. Dr. Jabez Bowen himself was an enslaver, and he also participated in the business of slavery. As a doctor, he made the medicine chest for several slave voyages, including the Sally, which we will talk about in a little bit. And so he was connected, he and his family, the Bowen family, were a large family in Providence, and they were connected to slavery in multiple ways. As policymakers, including Lieutenant Governor, his nephew, as enslavers, enslaving individual people, as medical providers, and investing both directly and indirectly in the slave trade. I was interested to find that Bowen provided the medical chest for the Sally, which led me to questions about what does it mean to provide medical care for enslaved people. We take for granted that people come to medical care consensually, and while it may be considered useful by the enslaver to provide medical care, and I certainly don't advocate for the denial of medical care, there's a lot of ethical gray areas there. And there's no question, regardless of the ethics, that Bowen made money by selling these medical kits directly to the enslavers and enslaved voyages. We also know that at least 3 enslaved people lived with Dr. Bowen: Jenny, her daughter Dinah, and Fortune. They lived in this house. Okay, so quickly, let's jump over to Market Square. Market Square is number 8 on the map. Yes, right there. Okay. So Market Square is a small area which includes the market house itself and the area around it. The market house itself was built in the late 1700s, and Pero Paget was one of the laborers. We touched really quickly on Pero Paget earlier, as he was buried in North Burial Ground. He was enslaved by Henry Paget, who lived very close to Market House. And Henry Paget lent Pero's labor out to a variety of civic projects, pocketing the wages for himself. Part of the system of slavery meant that an enslaver could contribute to a project by loaning the enslaved person's labor and get the credit, or rent the enslaved person's labor out and be paid for it. In the records of Market House, we do see quite a bit of the work was done by Pero Paget. And it's important for me to recognize that, because walking around the city of Providence now, knowing as I do that many of the buildings, as well as the infrastructure, bridges, roads, were actually built by free and enslaved Black people, it helps me to understand the contributions and the knowledge and skills that went into these buildings. It helps for me to diversify the way I think of laborers, the way I picture the people who put this work and built Providence, and the type, what that means for people to get credit for that. This market house was built by a group of people, including also Thomas Shoemaker, who had been recently freed in 1775, and Pomp Smith, who I haven't been able to find much information about yet. So it wasn't just who built Market Square that makes it important, but also that the business of slavery was conducted there. There was a coffee house. If you look at this directly to the right of Market House, there's a coffee house called Crown Coffee House, and we know from records that at least one enslaved person was auctioned there. We also know that a lot of business was conducted there. Some of that business was the insurance business and the banking business. When we think about slavery in Providence, we understand that the majority of voyages didn't leave from Providence, but many of them were insured by Providence insurers and funded by Providence bankers. So it's kind of an ecosystem of the business of slavery happening in this area. And also the Providence Gazette was for a while located there. It was located in a couple of different locations, but the Providence Gazette was the newspaper, the main newspaper during this time. And one of the things that was featured in the newspaper was runaway ads. These were advertisements placed by an enslaver that directed the public to look out for what they would consider their property and warn people against taking in these enslaved people. They also published stories in support of slavery, and the newspaper itself produced narratives that contributed to white supremacy, and it was very unequal in the way that it presented stories, very biased. And that's part of the story of it's part of a historical record. And it's, when we look back on history and we read the newspaper, we have to remember how it was complicit in creating white supremacy and in promoting policies and mindsets. Some of these still affect the way we teach and understand history today, and the way we think about the history of race in Providence. So Market Square, Market House, and also kind of looking at who ended up working in Market House. We have to also remember there was a few Black people who actually had stands there, a butcher, a refreshment stand, and there were also people who had carts selling things that included a number of Black people over the years. Okay, quickly, let's jump over to the Hopkins House, Stephen Hopkins House, and that should be number 9. Yeah, number 9 on the map. Okay. So the Hopkins House is one of the oldest houses remaining in Providence. It was originally down close by South Main Street, and it was moved up to its current location. And it was the home of Stephen Hopkins, who he's famous for being a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a 10-time governor of Rhode Island, and he was also an enslaver. This is important because during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, he compared the treatment of the colonists of Rhode Island to being enslaved. So he was very upset, as were several of the revolutionary founding fathers, very upset that being treated at what he considered to be a slave, but at the same time, didn't have very many qualms about being an enslaver himself. This house is very important to me because it's one of the few places that we're able to stand in something that was itself a slave quarters. You could go into the Stephen Hopkins House, go upstairs, and actually feel the difference between the house, the space of the Hopkins family, and the space that was delegated to the enslaved people. We know that at least 6 people that were enslaved did live and work here. Fibba, Bonner Brown Jr., Fibba's son, St. Iago, Primus, Adam, and Prince, and they all lived and worked in this house together. So Stephen Hopkins was a Quaker, and he did eventually emancipate 5 of the enslaved people in this house, except for Fibba. He refused to emancipate her, and according to him, it was because he didn't think she could make a living outside of his house. Which sounds fair in theory, but then he could have just paid her for her wages for her labor, rather than keep her enslaved. Upon his death, she was finally free and able to move in with her husband, whose name was Bonner Brown. He had been the father of Bonner Jr., who had been enslaved by the Brown family. He owned a house in the Olney's Lane neighborhood, and they were able to live together finally. And she died in 1820. She actually lived well into her 90s. So thankfully, she did have did get to enjoy some freedom. But this house itself is, I strongly recommend, if possible, if you go to no other house on this tour, go into that house and try to understand the spatial realities between the bedroom of Stephen Hopkins and his wife and the shared bedroom of the enslaved people of the house. Okay, quickly we'll touch on Brown University, which is, people probably know where that is, but yeah, right there. And that, a lot of work has been done on Brown University, so we don't talk too much about that here because it's very much done. But we will just touch on the fact that University Hall itself was built by a number of people of color, including Pero Paget, who we want to give all this credit to because he was one of the main people building that building. And when I alluded earlier to people of Providence renting out or donating labor, Brown University was built by multiple donations, including from the Browns. And Henry Paget was able to donate this work to Brown University and get the credit for it. So Pero Paget was one of those people who helped build it. Early chancellors of Brown were regularly enslavers. Oh, okay. And we'll quickly, there's a lot of Southern connections. Plantation owners would send their sons to Brown and to get educated in this kind of elite school in Providence to give this kind of air of elitism and credit to their Southern plantations. So a couple of other quick steps because we're running out of time here. We'll touch on John Brown House. John Brown was himself an enslaver. There was at least 10 enslaved people enslaved by the 4 Brown brothers and their business. This is an excellent place to go to learn more about the Sally, which was a slave trading voyage. Over half of the people that were enslaved aboard the Sally died along the way, including one who unfortunately died by suicide, and several who were killed as a result of shipboard resistance, attempting to escape or take back their lives, and they were shot by the enslavers. The Welcome Arnold House is an interesting site of Black labor. He hired many Black people who worked aboard ship, including Mint Martin. And quickly, we'll talk about Manna Bernard, who was the person who created the first oyster and ale house in Providence. We don't know exactly where it was, but it was in the area of Fox Point. And he had been enslaved by Bernard, the French Huguenot you mentioned earlier. And he owned a business and was able to live independently in Stampers, which is a neighborhood now across from University Heights. He's also buried in North Burial Ground. And then India Point Park. India Point Park has been an area of great change. That is 14 on the map. And it began as a bustling seaport with docks, distilleries, rum, and snack bars, very much a site of the business of slavery and a site of labor for free and enslaved Black people. It's a locus of business and trade in Providence with warehouses, stores, rope walks where people actually made rope. And I think it's important to close with thinking about India Point as a location of a lot of labor of free and enslaved Black people, consensual and not. We know that several of the people enslaved by the Browns worked in a spermaceti candle works here. We know that they worked in distilleries here. We know that they worked on docks and on ships, doing things like loading and unloading the ships, caulking and fixing up, repairing the ships. There's also the labor of women, which is easily overlooked when we're talking about the types of work here. Caring for the families, cooking and cleaning, sewing, designing, growing and harvesting food. So all of this labor was able to happen thanks to the work of women, which often goes uncredited. And maybe we don't have as many records there, but we can recognize that they contributed. So when we think about the history of Providence, it's important to give credit to the work of everyone, not just the people with their names in history books. After the Civil War, new battles faced the Black community. We had waves of migration. We had new immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe, but also Cape Verde Islands and later the Caribbean, which changed the community of Providence. We could see how the past works to build a lot of what we have now in Providence. We can look at this map here and understand the history of how some of these areas were laid out and how it affects the way that Providence is today, both policy, geography, and it also helps us to see the threads of survival that run through the story. Community contributions, care work that people performed. And I think next we're going to go into a very quick Q&A session, and I'm also very excited to hear Mr. Azar take us into how all of this history has contributed to the present situation in Providence, both with planning and otherwise. So it's 12:45. I will stop talking and ask for your questions or comments.
I just want to quickly thank Tracy for that. And if we could just spare Bob 5 minutes to just talk about like North Main Street and all the wonderful work that's going on around pedestrian and biking. And then we'll jump into Q&A for the last 10 minutes.
Thanks, Annette. Would you mind allowing me to share my screen?
No, I think that's up to Jeff can do that.
All right, Jeff, thank you.
Yep.
If you wouldn't mind.
One moment.
Okay,
I think
so
I'm gonna have to make you a host.
yep, that'd be great. So I just want to talk about a few things here. First of all, this is the first session that I've been involved in that I believe will qualify for certification maintenance credits for this new category of equity. And just to we have this new AICP code of ethics that speaks very clearly about incorporating equity principles into making plans and as we implement our plans as well. And so that's really something that is, we have talked about equity, but I don't think that we've really fully incorporated it into our plans, and it's something that we're striving to do as we are just beginning the process of updating the city's comprehensive plan, and it's really one of the fundamental principles as we work our way into this. I just want to talk about a couple of things that historically, as you know, long after the end of slavery, there were a lot of things that we planners did in Providence that still had discriminatory effects. And just to touch on a couple of those, first of all, redevelopment. We did a lot of redevelopment in this city, and just want to pull up my screen here and give you a little sense of that. We're showing some aerial photos from the 1950s. The State House right here, North Main Street. Here's the North Burial Ground. And there's a neighborhood here back in the 1950s called Lippet Hill. This was the subject of a redevelopment effort. And back in the 1960s, when we talked about redevelopment, it was identifying areas that were considered to be slums and have blighted conditions. And the way we dealt with that was slum clearance. And here's a pretty stark illustration of what that looks like. This is 1950, this is 1962. And as you can see, this basically entire neighborhood, primarily Black neighborhood, was obliterated. And today we know this as University Heights. It is a mixed income community. There was kind of a utopian plan here to have a mixed income community, and it persists today, but very different from what had existed. And we don't do planning this way anymore. We would never go in and obliterate an entire neighborhood like that. So, you know, we've really thought a lot about how we do redevelopment. We still do it, but it's primarily focused on identifying, you know, very specific instances, and in many cases trying to rehabilitate housing for affordable housing as opposed to taking everything out. So that's one thing that has changed over the years and is still in the process of changing. Another thing that we do a lot of in Providence is historic district zoning. And traditionally that's been an effort in preserving historic architecture. The Welcome Arnold House that Tracy showed us over on Planet Street, that is in a historic district, and that the rehabilitation of that house was overseen by our Historic District Commission. But all too often, we don't focus on the cultural history of what happened there. I knew that that was the name of that house. You see historic houses with names on them, but you always don't associate a history and a legacy with those. So today, that house is being used for rentals, I believe primarily to students. It bears that name, but we often really don't understand that history. So I think that's a way, you know, planning is changing in that respect around historic districts and really recognizing, you know, not just the architectural significance, but also the cultural significance. And then finally, zoning. You know, a lot of us have read about the history of zoning and some of the discriminatory effects that zoning can have. I believe that in Providence, we've done a pretty good job of you know, with our zoning code of trying to recognize the existing fabric and to allow for infill at densities that are similar to what we see, and we try to find places for redevelopment and higher intensity. That, along with our historic district zoning, kind of form the framework of how we grow and change in the city. But as we move into this next round of comprehensive planning, we really are going to be thinking a lot about you know, how our zoning has shaped the city, and if there are inequities that have been caused by zoning, how we can address those moving forward. And then last thing I'll say is along with that, the city is always changing. It's always growing. As Annette alluded to, we do have big plans for that corridor along North Main Street that we've been talking about. primarily as a mixed-use corridor with high density, well served by public transportation, and hopefully including a good mix of affordable and market rate housing. And so I think, you know, with planning, it's always a work in progress. You come into this sort of inheriting the legacy of people who came before you, and hopefully with our plans, we can recognize that history and do it justice as we move forward. So that's all I have to say. Happy to turn it over to the host for Q&A.
Thank you, Bob. If you wouldn't mind making me host again.
Be happy to do that. Let's see. It's APARI.
Correct.
Make host. There you go.
Thank you much.
So I'd like to just open it up for Q&A. I'm sorry, we have a scant 6 minutes left here, but if you just want to unmute yourself, and if you have questions for either Tracy or Bob, or if you want to offer your own perspective on addressing equity in our city and town plans, by all means.
I'll ask a question then. For Tracy, what would you say is the most surprising thing that you came across in your research, something that you completely weren't expecting?
When I found that the question of Phyllis, Rose, and Fanny and their relationship was a big ongoing question amongst a very small group of historians in Providence. And when I found that their relationship, that they were mother, daughter, granddaughter, and that came up because they all caught smallpox and were sent to the smallpox hospital, which is another story, but that really blew me away, because in a situation where we have no records created and we have to rely on little bits of things that the city of Providence has saved, finding that was very personally exciting. And I think what that gave me was the idea that it is possible to piece some of these stories together. It just takes a lot of time and energy.
Jeff, I have a question. Tracy, is there a date by which we know that slavery was over in Providence? Can we pin that to a date?
The last enslaved person was Richard James Arnold's servant. The son of Welcome Arnold was a major enslaver in Georgia and Rhode Island, and he would bring this woman back and forth as he traveled. And I can't tell you the date off the top of my head, but I could give it to you. I could let you know after looking it up. I'm not a date person, but that was really the mid 1800s, about 1850s.
Oh, that late, okay, interesting.
So, yeah, so the slave trade was over early 1800s. The majority of enslaved people in Providence were free by the early to mid 1800s, but by then there was still a small number of people still held in enslavement, born before the 1784 Gradual Emancipation Act.
Tracy, I have a question, if you would. First of all, I compliment you on this guide. It's a great geographical and educational resource, and I think it really puts it all together. That tells the story very concisely that the commission that Keith Stokes was involved with over the last year or so, and helps to bring that to the fore. Do you have any plans to more widely disseminate this story in public television or public radio, and to try to get it into the school system so that Rhode Islanders broadly know about this?
Yes, so that's a big question. I do walks for the CSS, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown. I do try to bring this into all of my research and work. I've got an exhibit up right now about the free grounds, which touches on these issues. But in terms of like broader, I would love Providence to build a history museum of Rhode Island history. That's missing here, and to keep putting out exhibits, curriculum, and other things like that. I hope that this will go more into this Providence Public Schools, especially the guide, the map itself, but also programming associated with it.
I ask
Be a
about,
great topic for a Rhode Island PBS documentary. They're working on one right now on the Narragansett Brewery. This would be as good as that, if not better.
can I ask about learning more about the Snowtown removal, where we might find resources? I was looking recently at history in East Greenwich and noted that there was a neighborhood called Scalloptown that disappeared, and was like to know more about that process.
So the research, I'm part of the research team, and there's also a programs team. And the programs team has organized walking tours of Snowtown. If you'd like to maybe give me your email in the chat, I could send you some of the resources that we have. Since
Great.
I could just go ahead and send it directly. We have a website and, a few other things like that.
Terrific.
And there will be an exhibit about the subject at the State House at some point, including artifacts from a archaeological dig of the North Shore Historic Site. There's a large collection of artifacts there.
Thanks.
Well, I see we are at 1 o'clock on the dot, and I really want to thank both our speakers and Jeff and Patrick for hosting. It was nice to see so many old colleagues on the call today and new. Tracy, it's okay if we share your email with participants? Yes. So people can reach out, and again, let us know if this is something that we'd all be up for in person. I know that I definitely want to break out the map and go do the walk when it's warmer. But Lily, knowing that there's something that used to be in East Greenwich, it seems like there's probably a story for many municipalities here that can be told. So with that, have a lovely afternoon, everyone. And thank you all very much for being here today.